2 hours ago, the White House issued a trade directive that every automotive executive in North America has been dreading for 18 months. President Trump signed an emergency executive order imposing a 100% tariff on all Canadian-origin automotive components entering the United States, effective at midnight tonight. Simultaneously, the order strips federal clean energy incentives, worth up to $7,500 per vehicle, from any automobile assembled in America using Canadian-sourced parts. Not reduced, not phased, eliminated, overnight. The directive names no individual company. It does not need to. Every car manufacturer with assembly operations in the United States knows exactly what this means. Because every car manufacturer with assembly operations in the United States depends on Canadian components at multiple stages of production. Not as a preference, not as a cost optimization, as a structural reality built over 40 years of integrated continental manufacturing that cannot be unwound by executive order in a single night. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, Toyota's North American division, Honda, every one of them woke up this morning to the same calculation, and the calculation does not work. The White House directive has 3 operational components, each one designed to apply maximum pressure to the automotive supply chain while maintaining plausible economic framing. First, effective midnight tonight, all Canadian-origin automotive components, defined as any part, sub-assembly, or raw material with Canadian content exceeding 15% of total value, are subject to a 100% tariff at point of American entry. The average modern vehicle contains between 1,800 and 2,200 individual components. Canadian suppliers provide significant portions of the steel stampings, aluminum castings, electrical wiring harnesses, and drivetrain components that flow into American assembly plants daily. At 100% tariff, the economics of using Canadian components collapse instantly. The parts become more expensive than assembling from domestic supply that does not yet exist at the required scale. Second, any vehicle assembled in an American plant that used Canadian-sourced components at any stage of its production, including components already on the factory floor before midnight tonight, is reclassified as a partially foreign manufactured vehicle and loses eligibility for federal electric vehicle tax credits and manufacturing incentives. The retroactive application to inventory already in production is the element that has automotive legal teams working through the night. It is not clear that it is enforceable. What is clear is that it creates enough legal uncertainty to halt production decisions immediately. Third, any American automotive manufacturer that sources more than 30% of its component value from Canadian suppliers is placed under a federal supply chain review, during which it cannot receive new federal contracts, fleet purchase agreements, or Defense Department vehicle orders. General Motors' federal contract portfolio alone exceeds $3 billion annually. Washington's logic was direct and, on the surface, coherent. The automotive industry cannot absorb a 100% tariff overnight. Assembly plants need continuous component flow. Disruption in the supply chain and industry executives will descend on Ottawa within 48 hours, demanding that Canada remove whatever barriers triggered the American response. The directive was designed not to punish Canada indefinitely, but to create such immediate operational pain inside American companies that corporate America would do Washington's negotiating for it. The White House gave this strategy a name inside internal memos that have since been described to financial media. They called it reverse pressure. Make American companies the enforcement mechanism. Let Detroit squeeze Ottawa so Washington does not have to. Mark Carney had been waiting for reverse pressure for 11 months. 63 minutes after the directive was made public, Carney did not walk to a podium. He walked the floor of a Ford assembly plant in Oakville, Ontario. He stood on the factory floor, surrounded by UAW-affiliated Canadian auto workers, in front of a production line that builds vehicles sold in the United States. The visual was not chosen casually. Every element of it was a message directed not at Washington, but at Detroit. And what he said next made clear that Carney understood exactly how the reverse pressure strategy worked, and had built a response that ran it directly into a wall. He opened with one sentence. Detroit does not shut down because Canada stops. Detroit shuts down because Washington forgot how cars are made. Then he announced what Canada was doing. And unlike the reverse pressure strategy, which required American companies to act as intermediaries, every element of Canada's response was direct, immediate, and already operational. The first countermeasure, Canada is immediately invoking automotive-specific provisions under USMCA's Rules of Origin framework, reclassifying the integrated North American automotive supply chain as a protected continental manufacturing system exempt from unilateral national tariff actions. The legal filing was submitted to the USMCA Secretariat 40 minutes before Carney reached the podium. It triggers an automatic injunction process that prevents the midnight tariff from taking legal effect on components that are already mid-production in the continental supply chain. Parts currently on trucks between Windsor and Detroit, and there are thousands of them at any given moment, cannot legally be subjected to retroactive tariff classification while the injunction is active. The midnight deadline Washington set does not apply to supply already in motion. But this is where the response reveals how thoroughly Canada had studied the reverse pressure strategy. The second countermeasure was not directed at Washington. It was directed at the same automotive executives Washington was counting on to pressure Ottawa. Carney announced that Canada is immediately activating bilateral automotive partnership agreements with Germany, Japan, and South Korea, pre-negotiated frameworks under which Canadian component manufacturers can redirect production capacity toward European and Asian automotive supply chains within 90 days. BMW's North American procurement team was already in contact with Canadian suppliers before Carney finished speaking. The message to Detroit was precise. If Washington makes the Canadian supply relationship untenable, Canadian capacity will not sit idle waiting for the dispute to resolve. It will be contracted to your competitors' supply chains while you wait. The third countermeasure was the one that stopped the room cold. Canada is immediately suspending production at its three largest automotive assembly plants, the Oakville Assembly Complex, the Windsor Assembly Plant, and the Brampton Assembly Plant, not because Canada cannot continue producing, but because all three plants produce vehicles that are sold into the American market. Carney announced that production will remain suspended until the directive is rescinded or legally stayed. The suspension is not a strike. It is not a labor action. It is a deliberate, calculated withdrawal of supply from the American automotive market that Washington had not modeled because it assumed Canada needed American consumers more than American consumers needed Canadian production. What Washington had not modeled, those three plants collectively produce 450,000 vehicles annually for the American market. Chrysler Pacifica, Ford Edge, Lincoln Nautilus. The waiting lists for several of those models already exceed 6 months. The suspension does not hurt Canadian auto workers immediately. Carney announced full government wage support for all affected employees for the duration of the suspension. What it does is remove supply from an American market where demand already exceeds inventory. Then Carney said something that no one in the automotive industry expected. The fourth countermeasure, Carney revealed that Canada had spent the previous 11 months quietly negotiating a continental automotive supply chain resilience agreement with Mexico. Under the agreement, signed 2 weeks ago and held for exactly this moment, Canada and Mexico are establishing a joint North American components exchange that routes critical automotive supply around American intermediaries. Canadian wiring harness manufacturers, Mexican stamping plants, European electronic component suppliers with North American distribution, all connected through a supply framework specifically designed to serve automotive assembly plants in Canada, Mexico, and, critically, American plants that choose to source outside the new tariff structure. He looked directly into camera. We did not build this because we wanted to compete with the United States. We built this because the United States told us, through 18 months of unilateral action, that we needed to be ready to operate without it. The American automotive industry's response did not wait for press releases. Within 90 minutes, every major American automaker had contacted either the White House, the USTR, or both. The content of those conversations was not disclosed publicly. The behavior that followed told the story. Ford's government relations team issued a public statement, unusually direct for a company that almost never criticizes federal trade policy publicly, describing the directive as creating an immediate and unmanageable production disruption and calling for urgent dialogue to prevent assembly line shutdowns within 72 hours. General Motors' statement was shorter and harder. The directive creates conditions under which continued North American production cannot be maintained at current levels. Stellantis, whose Windsor plant produces the Chrysler Pacifica, one of the best-selling minivans in America, said nothing publicly. Stellantis called 3 Republican senators directly. The United Auto Workers Union issued a statement that Washington had not anticipated from a union that had spent years in complicated tension with both major parties over trade policy. The UAW came down clearly and without qualification on the side of Canada's position. The statement read in its central passage that the directive threatens more American auto worker jobs in 72 hours than any Canadian trade practice has threatened in the past decade. The union representing American manufacturing workers was publicly aligned with the Canadian Prime Minister against an American executive order. The reverse pressure strategy had produced the opposite of its intended effect. The supply chain numbers that began circulating through industry analysis in the hours after the directive explain why. The integrated North American automotive supply chain moves approximately $35 billion in components across the U.S.-Canada border annually. The average vehicle assembled in a Michigan plant crosses the border in component form between 5 and 8 times before final assembly is complete. A single wiring harness, the nervous system of a modern vehicle, may be manufactured from Canadian copper, assembled in a Canadian facility, shipped to an American plant for installation, returned to Canada for a subsystem test, and reshipped to the American plant for final integration. A 100% tariff applied at each crossing does not double the cost of that component. It multiplies it by a factor that makes the entire production model economically non-viable overnight. The automotive sector employs 1.7 million Americans directly and supports an estimated 7.25 million jobs in the broader supply ecosystem. The geographic concentration of those jobs is not random. They are concentrated in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, states whose electoral votes have determined the outcome of the last 4 presidential elections. The political geography of the American automotive workforce is not an abstraction. It is the most precise map of electoral vulnerability that exists in American politics. Republican congressional delegations from those states understood this within minutes of the directive becoming public. The response from within the president's own party was the fastest and the most unified of any reaction to any trade action in the preceding 18 months. The governor of Michigan issued a statement calling the directive an act of economic self-destruction targeting the heartland of American manufacturing. The governor of Ohio, a state that has not supported a Democratic presidential candidate in a generation, announced he was dispatching his economic development director to Ottawa for immediate consultations. The senior Republican senator from Michigan, whose state contains more automotive assembly capacity than any other in the nation, gave a floor statement that used language rarely heard from a member of the president's party about a presidential action. The directive, he said, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how American manufacturing actually functions and must be reversed before it causes irreversible damage to the industrial base this administration claims to be protecting. The international dimension arrived quickly and aligned entirely with Canada. Germany's Automotive Industry Association, representing BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, and their supplier networks, issued a statement noting that German manufacturers with American assembly plants also depend on Canadian components and that the directive creates collateral disruption to European automotive investment in the United States. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry expressed concern about the implications for Toyota and Honda's North American manufacturing operations. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association described the directive as a systemic threat to the continental automotive supply chain that transcends the bilateral U.S.-Canada dispute. The reverse pressure strategy assumed that economic pain would flow in one direction. The actual architecture of North American automotive manufacturing ensures that economic pain flows in every direction simultaneously, and the American direction is the largest. So where does this go? Trump has three paths. Each one was modeled by Canada's strategic team before Carney walked onto that factory floor. Enforce the directive fully and watch American assembly plants begin controlled production slowdowns within 72 hours as component inventories that cannot be legally restocked under the new tariff structure begin to deplete. Ford has publicly stated 72 hours. GM has not stated a number publicly. People inside GM have told financial media the number is closer to 96 hours. After that, the most symbolically and economically significant manufacturing sector in American political geography begins to visibly shut down, not because of a foreign adversary, not because of a natural disaster, but because of a presidential executive order. Walk the directive back before the 72-hour clock runs out. But Canada's USMCA injunction is already filed. The bilateral automotive agreements with Germany, Japan, and South Korea are already activated. The Canada-Mexico supply framework is already operational. The Canadian assembly plants are suspended pending rescission. Walking back the directive does not automatically restore the supply relationship to its previous state. Canada's alternative supply contracts are real, and they have counterparties who will not simply step aside because Washington changed its mind. The supply chain that Washington tried to use as leverage has already begun to reorganize around Washington's absence. The third path, escalate beyond the automotive sector, runs directly into the reality that Canada has contingency responses prepared for every escalation scenario that the strategic team modeled over 11 months. Carney said this explicitly, on the factory floor, into the camera. We have not prepared for one scenario. We have prepared for all of them. 2 hours ago, the White House believed it had found the perfect lever. Not financial sanctions, not intelligence restrictions, not legal filings. The assembly line. The thing American workers touch every day. The thing swing state voters associate with their economic security. Apply pressure there, and corporate America would do the work. 2 hours later, the UAW is standing with Canada. The governors of swing states are calling Ottawa. European and Asian automakers are accelerating supply agreements with Canadian manufacturers. And the assembly lines that Washington chose as its leverage point are the same assembly lines that are now 72 hours from going quiet. Not because Canada acted against America, but because Washington acted against the architecture that keeps them running. Mark Carney did not stand at that podium in Oakville because it was symbolic. He stood there because he knew exactly what the reverse pressure strategy was designed to do. And he wanted every auto worker, every plant manager, and every automotive executive watching to see that the person who understood their industry was not the one who signed the directive. Detroit does not shut down because Canada stops. Detroit shuts down because someone in Washington forgot how cars are made. And the person standing on that factory floor had been waiting 11 months to say it.